And now I'm going to pass it over to Leon to talk about our dashboard. Take
Thank you,
it away,
Diane.
Leon.
Thank you, Diane. As Diane said, my name is Leon Papadopoulos. I'll be giving you a quick overview of the Safe Routes to School dashboard. First, to access it, go to the Evaluation tab on our main page, and from there, click on Dashboards under Table of Contents. Here you will see the link for the new SRTS dashboard. Click the link and you will be taken to the screen on the right. Once you are on the dashboard page, you will see all data that has been collected by our team in working with our partner schools. It's worth noting that you will only see the activities of partner schools on this dashboard. If you try to search for your school and it doesn't come up, that means your school is not a Safe Routes partner. The new dashboard is a great way to follow your school's engagement within the Safe Routes program. On the following slides, I will show you how to look up your school and view activities, event participation, information on parent guardian surveys, arrival dismissal observations, and more. And because this dashboard is directly linked to our team's Salesforce database, the information in here is updated weekly, and you can see the last updated date right below the map. The map with green dots in the center shows our Safe Routes partner schools throughout the state. The first step in using the dashboard is to decide how you want to find your school by using the filters on the left. Use the filters options on the left to find your school. Select city or town to show all partners in your municipality, or select school district to show partners in your school district. You can also type the first few letters of the school in the school box to locate a specific school. Lastly, you can search by your outreach coordinator. These filters can work together to narrow down your list or work independently if you know exactly what you're looking for. Each time you select an option in the filter, the list of the schools on the right will change and narrow down to a list that fits the filter criteria. The school listing shows basic information about the school, the date they joined our Safe Routes program, who their Safe Routes outreach coordinator is, along with their email and phone number, whether the school has received a Signs and Lines and/or infrastructure project, and if the school is considered to be within an environmental justice community. And to the right are the activities conducted by a given school and the date of the action or event. The actions and events chart below the map can be used to filter the activities on the right. For example, if you click on events pie chart and select pedestrian safety trainings, all the pedestrian safety trainings will show up on the right. If you click on any bar in the actions chart, those actions will also show up on the right. You can click anywhere on the screen to reset the charts and select another activity. And of course, as always, you can reach out to your coordinator or any of us on the team if you have any questions about your school's activities. We also have the ability to run a more extensive report over any period of time. Thank you, and I'm going to pass this along to Rachel McCaffrey to talk about some of our other new tools.
Thank you, Leon. So next, I'm going to review some of our new forms. So from the main Safe Routes to School webpage, you'll be able to access these two new partnership forms. The new partner form should be filled out by someone at the school who is authorized to sign on behalf of the school. This is typically the principal, assistant principal, or a school committee member. Remember, before signing up to be a partner, check the partner list on the main page of the website, which is a PDF that is updated quarterly. You can also go to the dashboard that Leon just reviewed and check to see if your school is listed. As Leon mentioned, the dashboard is updated weekly, so that list is more current. When filling out the form, please add the full address of the school and provide enrollment and grade information. Once you click submit, the form will be emailed to you and to the Safe Routes to School program for processing. Your assigned outreach coordinator will then contact you to set up an initial meeting. The process is similar for signing up to be an alliance partner. Alliance partners can be local or statewide, community, government, or nonprofit organizations. We look for partners who focus on safety, health, and wellness, or the environment as it pertains to children and families. Your organization will collaborate with the Safe Routes to School team to encourage walking and bicycling, serving as a resource for elementary and middle school partners. Alliance members will be featured on our website and promoted through our school partnerships and Safe Routes to School marketing efforts. You can view a PDF list of Alliance partners on the main page of the website. At the bottom of the main website page is our Safe Routes to School request form. If you don't know who to contact, but you are interested in scheduling a meeting or requesting resources, you can use this form. Here is a list of what you can request on the form. There is also a small description of each item on the request form. When the form is submitted, an automated email will be generated that will notify the Safe Routes to School team. We will be in touch shortly after to coordinate your request. Now, although this is not a new tool for us, it may be new to some of you. Several years ago, we launched our online flagship event registration tool. The link to this portal is on the Safe Routes to School encouragement page. This tool registers your school to participate in and to order incentives for our 3 flagship day events, including International Walk, Bike, and Roll to School Day in October, Winter Walk in February, and Massachusetts Walk, Bike, and Roll to School Day in May. You can order from a variety of walk, bike, and roll stickers and bookmarks. Once you submit your order, your outreach coordinator will arrange to get the order shipped. The system does keep track of duplicate registrations and will not allow you to submit again if someone has already registered the school. This is a new function of the tool within the last year.